Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're giving you a first-hand look at the shifting sands of the transatlantic relationship.
That's right. We've tapped into some really unique insights.
Exactly. Someone who was recently right there in Washington, D.C., talking directly with, a whole range of U.S. political figures. And your goal, as our listener, is really to cut through the noise, understand what's actually going on, without getting sort of bogged down in endless detail.
Yeah, get straight to the point.
Our mission here is to pull out the crucial insights. What's the U.S. perspective on Europe? And maybe more importantly, what does that mean for us, especially if you're listening in the Netherlands?
Right.
We're going to drill down into three key areas. First, the lasting earthquake that was Trump in the U.S.
Still feeling the tremors.
Definitely. Second, how America now sees its role in the world.
A big shift there.
And finally, the knock-on effects for the relationship between Europe and, specifically the Netherlands and the United States. So let's just dive straight in.
Okay, well, the most immediate and honestly kind of shocking takeaway was this feeling that the U.S. and Europe are currently operating on, well, it felt like two completely different planets. Yeah, really struggling to even understand each other's basic language when it comes to global stuff.
That really struck me too, especially when we heard about the media landscape back in March. European news was all, serious war talk.
Very focused on Ukraine.
While the American media was actually discussing ceasefire possibilities, potential peace deals with Russia. It was weird.
Like parallel universes, exactly.
So I guess the first insight for listeners is we just can't assume we're all on the same page anymore, even on really critical global events.
And it's vital, really vital, to grasp that the people our contacts spoke with, they consistently said Trump isn't the sole cause of this.
Okay.
He's more accurately seen as a symptom, a visible sign of much deeper things happening under the surface in American society.
That's a crucial distinction, isn't it? It's not just one guy. It's something, deeper. And it kind of rings a bell with things we've seen closer to home, right?
So?
Well, we heard that quote from an American female politician. She said Trump got elected because he voiced things lots of Americans were thinking privately, but maybe we're afraid to say out loud.
Right, tapping into something unspoken.
It almost mirrors the rise of someone like Pim Fortuyn here in the Netherlands, that very direct, I say what I think, sometimes provocative style.
Precisely. And it points to a big fracture within America where certain topics have become almost untouchable, taboo, really, for one side of society. But here's where it gets really interesting. Even some Democrats, privately, admit they agree with certain things Trump has said or, started.
Really? That's unexpected. Can you give us an example?
Yeah, we heard about a former Democratic minister, someone with a long history in Democratic circles. Now, this person disagreed with Trump almost daily, fundamentally, but admitted believing that Trump, deep down, acts out of a desire for what he thinks is best for the country.
Interesting perspective, even from an opponent.
And then there was this Democratic congressman at a dinner who jokingly said he was more Mad G than most Republicans.
You're kidding. Why?
Because he genuinely thought Trump's tariffs could actually bring back jobs, boost his state's steel industry.
Wow. Okay, those examples really bring it down to earth. So the key insight here is Trump didn't just invent this discontent.
No.
He was more like a catalyst.
Yeah.
Accelerating this pre-existing deep dissatisfaction in American society.
Exactly. You're talking about things that have been simmering for ages. Frustrations about, say, costly foreign wars.
Right.
The huge national debt, the debates around migration, and what get called, broadly woke themes. Social justice issues that have become supercharged politically.
Okay, I see.
And the feeling is, this underlying movement, it's now a force that, it can't easily be stopped. Doesn't matter who's in the White House next.
So it's not just a political swing.
No, it feels more fundamental, like a forceful tearing down of a system, but without a really clear plan for what comes next. And then you layer on top the whole global situation, Ukraine, Russia, China, it just adds another level of complexity.
And we can't ignore that whole issue of corporatism, can we? The tight links between big companies and government in the U.S., the huge influence of money in politics.
Oh, absolutely. The pressure on Congress members, always fundraising because of those short 2-year election cycles, it puts a massive strain on everything.
Right.
What's really fascinating is the sense you get that a foundational system is being kind of deliberately dismantled, even if some parts of it weren't really working anymore.
It makes you think about shifts over here in Europe, doesn't it? Like in the Netherlands, the recent election saw parties way outside the establishment gaining a lot of ground.
Yeah, definitely a sign of broader public unhappiness with the status quo.
But is it the same?
Well, the sense we get from our source is that this American movement might be uh, deeper, more fundamental, potentially more transformative than what we're seeing in Europe right now.
Really? How so?
It could even have big implications for European institutions like the EU down the road.
And it seems tied into that growing feeling against big government,
Yeah.
especially Washington, D.C.
Exactly. A real pushback against centralized power, perceived overreach.
And that anti-government feeling seems linked with skepticism towards globalization.
Very closely linked, yeah. Trump's whole perceived mission to sort of dismantle globalism resonates strongly with a big chunk of the U.S. population.
Okay, let's dig into that anti-globalism agenda a bit more. What's driving it? What does it look like?
At its core, it's really a rejection of the dominant economic and financial policies we've seen since maybe the 80s. Like, outsourcing jobs, the heavy focus on Wall Street. There's a really strong push now to prioritize national identity, national interests over international deals.
Okay.
And we're also seeing, alongside that, a questioning of established science in some areas, like climate research and critiques of what get labeled woke agendas in universities and culture.
So it's like that historical pendulum in America, swinging between internationalism and isolationism, is now swinging hard towards a new kind of isolationism, fueled by this anti-globalist feeling.
That's a good way to put it.
You hear it in those questions, right? Why send billions to Ukraine when our bridges are falling down?
Or why foot the bill for European defense when China's the real challenge?
Exactly.
Yeah.
There's this growing feeling among many Americans that Europe has been, well, free riding on U.S. security for way too long.
Yeah, that phrase comes up a lot.
It does.
And it seems like there's a real split within the U.S. itself on this stuff. The view from, say, coastal cities might be totally different from the heartland. Oh, definitely. Priorities, even awareness of global events like Ukraine, can vary hugely. Someone in Central Florida might be much more worried about gas prices than geopolitics.
Which brings us to that book you mentioned, Taboo, by the Austrian psychiatrist, analyzing the European reaction to that Munich speech.
Yes, exactly. It's a fascinating argument.
What's the core idea?
Well, the book suggests the intense European outrage wasn't just about the content, but about the shattering of certain deeply held taboos.
Taboos, like what?
Like fundamental beliefs that Europe is, the ultimate model of democracy and free speech. The author talks about thought prohibitions, unspoken rules about what you can and can't openly discuss.
Denkverbot in German.
Precisely. The argument is that Western democracies are increasingly living within these invisible boundaries.
That's a really provocative thought. Can you give some examples of these supposed taboos?
Well, climate change is often mentioned as an area where debate can be difficult.
Okay.
Another example given was the initial, almost total dismissal of the lab leak theory for COVID-19.
Right, I remember that.
Even though later intelligence suggested it was plausible. Now, the point isn't necessarily whether the theory is true or false. Okay. But the way open debate, alternative views were often shut down, labeled as conspiracy or fringe. That's the taboo in action.
So it's about limiting what we feel we can even ask or discuss openly. How does that connect to politics and, well, someone like Trump?
The argument is it leads to a kind of depoliticization. Certain issues get framed as settled science or moral absolutes, leaving no room for actual political debate. You see this reliance on experts, on science, especially around security, whether it's public health security with COVID or national security with Ukraine. It becomes the unifying theme.
And these taboos, driven by fear or certainty.
They stifle debate. And debate is, the oxygen of democracy, right? When that happens, it can create an opening for someone outside the system, like Trump, who just smashes those unspoken rules.
Because people kind of sense when things aren't being discussed openly, even if they can't quite put their finger on it.
Exactly. People have common sense. They eventually recognize when, something's not right here. And that suppressed feeling can explode outwards. Trump tapped into that.
And it connects back to basic rights, the Constitution.
In a way, yes. Those rights aren't just to protect us from the government. They also protect the government from itself by stopping it from eroding open discourse, which ultimately undermines its own legitimacy.
So Trump's rise is deeply linked to this feeling that certain big issues became off-limits for real debate, maybe amplified by things like the pandemic.
That's a key part of the argument, yes. And the book warns Europe against just reacting with moral outrage towards the U.S.
Why?
Because while the concerns might be valid, that immediate condemnation can actually block a real understanding of why things are happening, the forces driving Trump's support.
So the need is to observe, analyze, learn.
Observe with open eyes, yeah. Learn from it rather than just dismissing it.
Okay, that's a lot on Trump's lasting impact. Let's shift to our second area.
Yeah.
America's changing role in the world. What are the underlying drivers here, especially economically?
Well, a huge factor, you really can't overstate it, is the American financial situation, specifically the national debt. It's becoming, frankly, unsustainable.
How so?
There's this economic indicator, sometimes called the Ferguson Law. It's basically when a country's monthly interest payments on its debt become higher than its defense spending.
Okay.
Historically, that's seen as a major red flag, a sign of potential long-term decline in a state's power. And the U.S. crossed that line last year.
Wow. That's significant. A key insight for Europe to consider, definitely.
It really is. And yeah, lots of countries have high debt. France, the UK, Italy, Spain, even the Netherlands, if you include private debt.
Right.
But the sheer scale in the U.S. makes it critical. And this financial pressure is a massive driver for rethinking global commitments.
So how does that pressure show up in policy, in their global stance?
Well, look at the tariff disputes, for instance. Part of that is likely driven by a need to try and lower interest rates, maybe weaken the dollar, cut trade deficits, all ways to manage the debt.
Makes sense.
Plus, think about globalization's impact. All that outsourcing, especially to China, made the U.S. really dependent on other countries for key things, like rare earth minerals for tech.
So now there's a push to reverse that, bring industry back.
Exactly. Bring manufacturing back, strengthen the economy from within, become less reliant on potentially hostile supply chains.
Okay.
And it's not just manufacturing, it's R&D too. Alongside this economic shift, you see this change in how America views its global role.
The policeman of the world idea.
Yeah, there's a clear desire now under the current government to scale that back. Now, that sentiment isn't totally new. It comes and goes.
Right.
But it's much stronger now, amplified by that nationalist feeling we talked about.
So step back from being the global enforcer, but not give up being a superpower.
Pretty much. Find a way to engage that's less costly financially and politically.
Which leads to that argument that others are being unfair.
Exactly. This perception that allies, especially, are taking advantage, not paying their fair share, and need to cough up more if they want U.S. help.
It still feels a bit strange, though, doesn't it? The world's biggest power feeling wronged.
It does seem a bit incongruous. Maybe it's partly because America's a younger nation, still has some idealism left compared to Europe with its, long, bloody history of power politics.
Maybe.
But the desire to focus inward on migration, infrastructure, domestic problems is definitely getting stronger.
So the future positioning looks more transactional.
More focused on clear U.S. interests, definitely.
Yeah.
More transactional. Involvement in conflicts will likely drop unless there's a clear financial or political win for the U.S.
There's one big exception.
With the notable, long-standing exception of Israel, that relationship remains unique.
Right.
Though, interestingly, our contact did mention hearing maybe slightly more critical voices in the U.S. media about the Israeli lobby's influence lately. It's a subtle shift, perhaps.
But pivoting to the even bigger factor shaping things, China.
China, absolutely. Its growing global position is central.
And it's important for listeners to remember, right, that a lot of what Trump's doing now isn't totally out of the blue.
Not if you paid attention to his campaigns or things like Project 2025. These policies have been talked about for years.
People are often cynical about politicians keeping promises.
But Trump often does, actually, for better or worse.
So this pushback against China, it's not just Trump.
Oh, no, it's bipartisan, really. Started under Obama, ramped up by Trump, continued, maybe differently, by Biden. Trump's just escalating it now because China is seen as the main long-term rival.
And we see China's influence growing everywhere, don't we? Their navy, their economic reach.
Definitely. Even with their recent economic bumps, COVID policies, the property debt issues, their overall rise is undeniable.
Militarily, they're still catching up in some areas.
Oh, yeah. Things like aircraft carriers take time. But the U.S. clearly sees China as a systemic competitor. They want to counter its influence in global systems.
What about Russia, though? That seems almost contradictory sometimes. This idea of maybe doing a deal.
Yeah, there's that idea floating around, Normalize relations, maybe try to pull Russia away from China.
But is that realistic?
It's tough. Relations between Moscow and Beijing are very strong now, and Russia hasn't exactly had great experiences dealing with the U.S. So, despite some talk of a deal, the main focus, the main perceived threat for the U.S. establishment remains China.
Which we see in the trade wars, the tech competition.
Exactly. And the push to bring manufacturing back from China.
But we have seen some backtracking on tariffs recently. What's behind that?
Good question. It could suggest some internal pushback, maybe from big tech figures, maybe Wall Street concerns, though that's less of a priority for Trump, perhaps.
Or maybe worries about the bond market?
Could be. It makes the implementation seem a bit less confident, raises questions about whether they've really thought through all the consequences.
So less strategic, maybe more reactive.
Sometimes it feels that way, yeah. Like maybe it's partly for show, rather than a fully baked strategy.
It paints a really complex picture. And despite all the talk about democracy ending in the U.S., our contact's experience in D.C. sounded different.
It did. Being able to walk around Congress freely, seeing citizens, protesters, the offices being welcoming, it suggests a more vibrant, accessible democracy than you might think from headlines.
Right.
Plus, you're seeing cracks even within the Republican Party.
Yeah.
The Freedom Caucus pushing back on budgets, Senate Republicans opposing tariffs on Canada. It's not a monolith over there.
Oh. Okay, let's move to our final and maybe most crucial area. What does all this mean for Europe, and specifically for the Netherlands? What's the core message from Washington?
Okay, the overwhelming feeling, and this came from almost everyone our contact spoke to, was blunt, basically. We have no more patience with Europe. We've had enough.
Wow.
Yeah.
Stark and worrying. What's driving that frustration?
Primarily, it's this long-standing perception that Europe just hasn't taken its own defense seriously enough, that it's relied on the U.S. security umbrella for too long.
Which isn't a new complaint, is it?
Yeah.
Obama said similar things.
True, but Trump's approach is much more forceful, much more direct, essentially telling Europe, pull up your own pants, focus on your own security while we focus on China and Asia.
So the irritation is growing, the patience is wearing thin.
Definitely. And that creates a dangerous situation where emotions could lead to really negative outcomes for the relationship.
It almost sounds like the U.S. is, I don't know, canceling the relationship because Europe isn't acting.
That's a strong way to put it, but it highlights the urgency. It means Europe absolutely has to engage in serious dialogue with the U.S. now, regardless of feelings about Trump or anyone else.
Because there's no alternative right now for security.
There really isn't. And Europe can't afford to respond with more finger-pointing or, moralizing lectures.
Because that just annoys them more, that perception of European moral superiority.
Exactly. That really grates on many Americans. And you also have to wonder if Europe sometimes being reluctant to fully back U.S. initiatives, maybe peace plans or foreign policy moves, adds to that frustration. Trying to work against the U.S. on major geopolitical issues would likely be a huge mistake for Europe. It could really backfire.
So the key takeaway is engage. But how?
European leaders need to somehow get past any moral outrage they feel and engage pragmatically, constructively. Publicly slagging off the U.S. makes productive talks almost impossible.
Doesn't mean abandoning principles, though.
No, not at all. But it requires a different way of talking. You don't build a relationship by constantly insulting the other side in public.
So European leaders need to understand why so many Americans voted for Trump, and maybe why parts of their own populations feel certain things need challenging.
Exactly. That understanding is crucial for having any kind of productive conversation, especially if there's another Trump administration.
It's about showing you want to understand their perspective, not just label them.
Precisely. Whether it's domestic politics or international relations, that's key.
And what about the Netherlands specifically, given our close historical ties?
Well, the Netherlands, like the UK, has often had that special relationship edge. So now, more than ever, the Dutch government needs to make developing a smart, proactive U.S. policy a top priority. Engage in a way Washington will actually respond to.
And can the Netherlands play a role within the EU context?
Potentially. Even as an EU member, the Netherlands needs to think about EU interests, of course. But by building a strong bilateral tie with the U.S., maybe the Netherlands can help open doors for better EU-U.S. relations overall. Act as a bridge, perhaps.
It's tricky, though, isn't it? Linking up with Trump might be politically difficult domestically, given his association with populist movements the EU often opposes.
That's a very real challenge. And when you see Trump's good relationship with someone like Orban, who's viewed very negatively in Brussels,
Right.
or his connections with figures like Musk, Maloney, even controversial ones from AFD or Nigel Farage, it just highlights the complexity.
But that complexity is exactly why the Netherlands needs to invest in the relationship.
I think so, yes. Europe, and the Netherlands within it, has to find a way past the moral objections and engage constructively, even if it means holding back on public criticism for a while to build a foundation for real talks.
Leaders need to jump over their own shadow, as you said.
Exactly. Be willing to step outside their comfort zone, really try to understand what's driving people, their own voters, and the American electorate.
That's a powerful and maybe sobering message for Europe. Okay, so let's quickly recap this deep dive. We've looked at the deep divisions in the U.S., the forces behind Trumpism.
The shift in America's global role,
Yeah.
driven by debt, China.
And this urgent, critical need for Europe and the Netherlands to proactively engage with the U.S. constructively, despite the difficulties.
Right. Which leaves us with a final thought, a question really, for you, our listener.
Yep.
Considering these really profound shifts in the U.S., what fundamental assumptions about the transatlantic relationship, about your own country's place in the world, what might Europeans need to urgently rethink?
And maybe what specific taboos or unspoken beliefs might be getting in the way of a more realistic, perhaps uncomfortable understanding of where things stand right now? Some really fundamental questions for us all to chew on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Till next time.